The dust had not yet settled behind her when Mae Reed realized she had crossed the line into New Mexico territory, and the only thing standing between her and the open horizon was a broad-shouldered man on a roan horse who did not look like he had any intention of moving. She pulled back on the reins of her borrowed mare, so hard the animal skidded sideways in the dry reddish dirt, hooves scattering pebbles that clattered down the shallow slope at the side of the road. The afternoon sun was burning low and mean behind her, throwing her shadow long and desperate across the ground, and the man on the roan simply sat there in the middle of the narrow trail, with his hat pushed back just enough that she could see the steady calm in his eyes. He had a jaw that looked carved from the same sandstone as the mesas behind him, dark with a few days of growth, and he was watching her with the kind of patience that only comes from a man who has spent long years in country that does not tolerate hurry. Mae's heart was slamming against her ribs. She did not look back. She had made a rule about that when she had crept out of the Harlan Reed homestead before first light with her satchel, her grandmother's brooch pinned inside her coat pocket, and a horse that technically belonged to her deceased husband's estate. She was not going to look back. Looking back would make everything real in a way she was not ready for. "Where are you going?" the man asked. His voice was low and even, not unkind, but it carried the kind of weight that filled the open air the way a church bell does when everything else has gone quiet. Mae lifted her chin. "Away," she said. He did not blink. He studied her the way a man studies weather on a horizon, trying to decide if it is going to become a problem. Then he said, "From what?" The question hit her somewhere beneath her sternum, and she did not have an answer ready because nobody had ever asked her that. They had asked her where she was going, back in Harlan's house, and her brother-in-law Clem had said she was a fool, and his wife Dorothy had said she was worse than that, and the whole town of Redstone crossing back in Colorado territory had likely already made up its mind about Mae Reed, but nobody had asked her from what. She stared at the man on the roan horse, and she did not speak for a long moment. The wind moved across the flats between them, carrying red dust and the smell of creosote and something distant that might have been rain. "That is a longer answer than I have time for," she said finally. One corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "All right," he said. He turned the roan horse sideways and gave her enough room to pass. "The road forks about 2 miles ahead. Left fork takes you toward Calla Springs. Right fork goes into the Mesa country, and there's nothing out there for 40 miles. Mae watched him. He had made no move to stop her. He was not reaching for anything. He was just sitting on that horse in the heat, giving her information she had not asked for. "Which way would you go?" she asked, and she did not entirely know why. "Left," he said. "Calla Springs has a boarding house run by a woman named Ida Foss. She doesn't ask questions, clean beds and the best biscuits in the territory." Mae looked at the fork in the distance, then back at him. "Are you following me?" "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm heading in the same direction. I can ride behind you or alongside you, or I can wait here a good long while if that suits you better. But that mare of yours is favoring her left foreleg, and she's going to need water before dark." Mae looked down at her horse. The mare was indeed standing with her left front hoof just slightly off the ground, and Mae felt a cold wash of guilt. She had pushed the animal hard. She had been pushing her since before sunrise, and it was now late afternoon, and she had been so focused on the putting of miles between herself and Redstone Crossing that she had not paid enough attention. "She's lame," Mae said. "Not badly, but she will be if you don't let her rest." He said it without accusation. "There's a creek about a mile on before the fork. I know where it is." Mae looked at this stranger on the road and made the calculation that women alone in 1878 in New Mexico territory had to make 100 times a day, the kind of calculation that balanced danger against danger and tried to find the least terrible of the options available. He had not threatened her. He had not blocked her passage once she had spoken. He had given her useful information without demanding anything for it, and her horse was hurting. "All right," she said. "Show me the creek." His name was Hugh Thatcher, and she learned that much before the creek because he offered it without being asked, which she appreciated more than she let show. He rode slightly ahead and to the left, cutting down off the trail into a shallow drainage she never would have found on her own, where a line of cottonwoods marked water the way a green ribbon marks a gift. The creek was low but running, clear over pale stones, and the mare put her nose down and drank long and slow while me sat on a flat rock at the bank and untied her satchel from behind the saddle. Hugh Thatcher dismounted and led the roan to drink downstream, giving the mare plenty of space. Then he crouched at the creek's edge and refilled a canteen without looking at me, or at least making a point of not looking, which she noticed. "You've come a long way," he said, studying the mud at the creek bank. "From Colorado by the dust on you. Is that a question?" "No," he said, "just an observation." Me pulled her satchel into her lap and checked the clasp for the 5th time that day. Everything was there. Her $32 and some change, which was everything she had managed to save over 3 years of a marriage that had started with hope and ended badly. Her grandmother's brooch. A letter from a woman named Clara, who ran a hat shop in a town called Mae Reed, New Mexico, who had advertised in a Kansas City ladies' paper for a seamstress with experience. Me had answered that advertisement 4 months ago and had been writing back and forth with Clara ever since, slowly making a plan the way you slowly let out a held breath. "Are you a rancher?" Me asked. It seemed important to know what kind of man she was sitting near. "I have a ranch," he said, "about 12 miles from Cala Springs. Cattle mostly, some horses." He paused. "I was coming back from delivering a horse to a man in Pueblo County." He glanced at her then. His eyes were hazel, she noticed. "Or maybe green. The light was playing tricks. I take it you did not plan to come this particular road." "I planned to be faster than this," she said honestly. He looked at the mare, who had lifted her head from the creek and was standing quiet, resting the leg. "She'll be all right. A night's rest and she'll do fine. Can you make Cala Springs before dark?" Me calculated. She could make it in the dark if she had to. She had the road fixed in her mind now, the fork left for Cala Springs. She had memorized every map she could find for the past 3 months. She was not a woman who left things to chance if she could help it. "I can make it," she said. "I know you can," Hugh Thatcher said. And there was something so straightforward and unadorned in the way he said it that me found herself looking at him with a kind of cautious attention she had not expected to feel. They rode to the fork and then along the left-hand road toward Cala Springs as the sky went orange and then deep rose, and then the first purple of evening began pooling in the east. Hugh Thatcher rode beside her now, not ahead, and the space between them was easy in a way that surprised her. He did not fill silence with noise. He let it sit there, which was a quality me had never found in a man before and had not known to want. Cala Springs was exactly what it sounded like. A small cluster of buildings around an actual spring, the water coming up from the rock in a steady, quiet rush that fed a long stone trough and then ran out under the main street in a culvert. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that looked well-behaved compared to some she had seen, a small post office that also appeared to serve as a barber shop, and at the far end of the one real street, a 2-story white building with a painted sign that read Ida's boarding house in letters that had been repainted recently and were still crisp. Hugh Thatcher brought her straight there. He helped her down from the mare, not because she needed help but because he put out his hand and it seemed rude not to take it, and his grip was firm and warm and he let go the instant her feet touched ground. He lifted her satchel from the saddle without being asked and handed it to her before she could say anything. "I'll take the mare to the livery and make sure she's seen to," he said. Me opened her mouth to say she would handle it herself. "Let me," he said quietly, not commanding, just asking. She looked at him a moment. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "I'm leaving mine there anyway, it's no trouble." She watched him lead both horses down the street, and she stood there in the early dark outside Ida Foss's boarding house, and felt the strange sensation of having been helped without being obligated, which was not a feeling she had much experience with. Ida Foss was a woman of about 50 with sharp dark eyes and hands that were powerful from a lifetime of work, and she looked me up and down once and seemed to make a complete assessment in about 4 seconds. $3 a week, meals included, she said. I don't allow men past the front parlor. Breakfast at 6, supper at 7. You miss a meal, you wait until the next one. That suits me perfectly, Mae said. She was given a room on the second floor that overlooked the main street, with a window that caught the evening breeze and a bed with an actual quilt on it. And Mae sat on that bed for a long time after she had washed her face and hands and changed into a clean dress, just sitting there in the lamplight with her hands in her lap, listening to the sound of Calla Springs going about its evening business below. It was a quiet town. That was the first thing she noticed. It was not the kind of town where trouble was always getting started. She had supper with 3 other boarders, a schoolteacher named Mrs. Pollard who was waiting to join her husband farther south, and 2 brothers who were hauling freight and had stopped for the week while their wagon axle was being repaired. Hugh Thatcher was not there, and Mae noticed his absence and then found herself irritated at having noticed it. But he was there the next morning. She came downstairs early, just after dawn, because she had always been an early riser, and because she wanted to visit the post office before she did anything else, to ask if there was any word from Clara in Myra Wells confirming her arrival date. The front parlor of Ida's boarding house was empty except for Hugh Thatcher, who was standing at the parlor window looking out at the street with a coffee cup in his hand and a look on his face like a man in the middle of a thought he had not finished yet. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. "Morning," he said. "You're staying here," Mae said, and immediately regretted how surprised she sounded. "Ida rents to men on the ground floor," he said. He held up the coffee cup. "She makes it strong." Mae went to the small sideboard where a tin coffee pot and several cups were set out and poured herself a cup. She stood on the opposite side of the parlor from him because that seemed appropriate and drank the coffee, which was indeed extremely strong. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Did you?" "Some," he said. He looked back out the window. "Your mare's doing well." Livery man looked at her leg. "Nothing broken, just needed the rest." "Thank you," Mae said. Genuinely. He looked at her, and the morning light coming through the parlor window caught him squarely, and she could see that he was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 either side of that, with the kind of face that had been made honest by weather and time and something else, something interior, something that had to do with whatever a man is or is not when nobody is watching. "You're heading to Myra Wells," he said. Mae's hand stopped with the cup halfway to her mouth. "How do you know that?" "I don't," he said. "I'm guessing. It's the next real town of size in that direction. There's work there. And you looked like a woman with a destination rather than a woman just running." Mae set down her cup carefully. "There is a difference." "Yes," he said. "A woman just running looks scared, you look determined." She did not know what to do with that, so she said, "Myra Wells, yes, I have a position there, seamstress work." "That's good work," he said. "Clara Hennessy's shop, probably. She's the only milliner in Myra Wells." "You know her." "Clara has made every woman in a 40-mile radius a hat at one point or another. Hard not to know her." He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it did something to the quality of the light in the room. "She's a good woman. You'll like her." Mae studied him. "You know a great deal about this territory." "I've been here 12 years, he said. "Since I was 19. He said it plainly, without pride or self-pity, just as a statement of fact, the way you say a door is made of oak. "Came out from Tennessee with a man who hired me to drive cattle. Man sold the cattle and left me here with $4 and a saddle." He paused. "Best thing that ever happened to me." Mae thought about that. She thought about what it meant to be left with almost nothing in a place you did not know and to call it the best thing. "Why?" she asked. "Because I was free to make it into whatever I decided to make it," he said. The words went somewhere quiet inside her and stayed there. Calla Springs had a post office inside Randall's General Store, which was a single large room crammed with everything from flour sacks to axe handles to ribbons and thread. And Mae went there after breakfast and found a letter waiting for her from Clara Hennessy of Myra Wells, written in a small, precise hand on pale blue paper, saying that the position was still available. The room above the shop was ready, and she should come whenever she was able. Mae read the letter twice standing at the counter, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her satchel beside her grandmother's brooch. She bought 2 spools of thread, a new needle case, and a small bar of soap that smelled of lavender, and while she was at the counter she asked Mr. Randall how long the ride was to Myra Wells. "'Bout 2 days on a good horse," he said. "Day and a half if you push it. But there's rough country in between, miss. You'd want company on that road." He said it without innuendo, just as a practical matter. There are men who ride that way now and then who'd let you travel with them for the safety of numbers. Hugh Thatcher goes that direction regular. His supply runs take him through Myra Wells sometimes. Mae thanked him and went back out into the bright morning street and stood for a moment in the sun, calculating. She was calculating when Hugh Thatcher fell into step beside her on the boardwalk, which startled her considerably. "Sorry," he said at once. "I wasn't trying to sneak up on you." "You walk quietly," she said, pressing her hand briefly over her heart. "Habit," he said. "Mr. Randall tell you the road to Myra Wells?" Mae gave him a sideways look. "Were you listening?" "I was outside," he said. "The window was open." She stopped walking and turned to face him. He stopped too and looked at her with that steady, patient expression that she was beginning to understand was simply the way his face arranged itself when he was being honest. "What is it you want to say?" she asked. "I'd like to ride with you to Myra Wells," he said. "If you're willing. I need to go that way for a delivery anyway. It's true, not an excuse. And the road is safer with 2. Mae looked at him carefully. In 1878, in New Mexico Territory, a woman did not travel alone on the open road for 2 days without accepting certain risks. She knew that. She had always known that and had planned to get through it anyway on stubbornness alone. But stubbornness was not a guarantee of safety, and Hugh Thatcher had, in the course of one afternoon and one morning, demonstrated nothing but consideration and practical good sense. "Do you always help people you meet on the road?" she asked. He thought about it. "No," he said, "not always." "Then why me?" He looked at her for a moment with those hazel-green eyes, and something moved in them, something careful and considered and entirely honest. "Because you said away," he said. "When I asked where you were going. And then I asked from what and you didn't answer, and I've been thinking about that answer ever since." Mae felt the back of her throat go tight in a way she did not expect. "We leave tomorrow morning," she said. "Early. I like to be in the saddle before full light." "So do I," Hugh Thatcher said. They left Calla Springs at 4:30 in the morning, when the sky was still full dark overhead but faintly luminous in the east, the kind of pre-dawn blue that exists for maybe 20 minutes before it becomes something else entirely. Mae had the mare, who was fully recovered and moving well, and Hugh had the roan and a pack mule loaded with the things he was delivering to a man in Myra Wells: bolts of heavy canvas and 3 coils of good rope, and a crate of glass lamp chimneys packed in straw. The road south out of Calla Springs ran through high desert country, red rock and scrub, and the occasional stand of pinyon pine dark against the sky. And in the earliest light it was deeply silent except for hooves on packed earth and the distant calling of an owl finishing its night. Mae rode with her coat buttoned because the desert mornings in late September of 1878 had teeth, and she watched the sky turn from dark blue to pale gray to the first blush of color along the eastern mesa, and found that the silence between herself and Hugh Thatcher was the same quality it had been the evening before, which was to say, comfortable. She had not experienced comfortable silence with a man before. Harlan Reed had filled silence with opinions. Before Harlan there had been her father, who had filled silence with demands. She had begun to think silence with a man was simply not possible, that men required the space to be constantly occupied with themselves. "You want to tell me," Hugh said about an hour into the ride. Mae looked at him. "Tell you what?" "What you're riding away from," he said. "You don't have to, but you've been carrying it pretty hard for someone who's already crossed the line." Mae was quiet for a while. The sun was coming up properly now, painting everything in layers of gold and copper, and the landscape was doing the thing it did in the desert morning, turning extraordinary as if surprised by its own beauty. "My husband died," she said finally, "8 months ago." "I'm sorry," Hugh said, and he meant it. She could hear that. "I'm not," she said, and then stopped herself. "I should be more careful with how I say that." "You can say it however it is," he said, me breath slowly. "Harlan Reed was not a good man to be married to," she said. "He was not violent, not in the way you might think. He never struck me. But he was the kind of man who reduces a person. You understand what I mean. You start out with a full sense of yourself and you find yourself getting smaller and smaller, your opinion taken away, your judgment questioned, the money you earn handled by someone else's hands, everything about your life belonging to someone else." She paused. "When he died, I was sad and guilty and relieved all at the same time, and the relieved part frightened me." "It shouldn't," Hugh said quietly. "His family didn't see it that way," me said. "His brother Clem decided I was to stay on at the property, essentially as unpaid labor, cooking and cleaning and mending while Clem ran the homestead. The estate passed to him. That was the law." She said the last 3 words with a particular flatness that conveyed exactly how she felt about it. "I had no legal claim. I was a widow with no property and no family of my own, and Clem was very clear about what my situation was." "So you left," Hugh said. "I left," me said. "I saved every dollar I could for 3 months. I answered an advertisement in a ladies' paper. I wrote letters. I made a plan. And 4 days ago, I walked out of that house before anyone was awake, and I took the horse Harlan had promised me years ago, but that was legally Clem's now, which I suppose makes me a horse thief." She said it with a kind of dark humor that was not quite detached, and Hugh turned his head and looked at her and then looked forward again and said, "The horse is returned, and none of the rest of it was your fault." "Clem will say otherwise," me said. "Will he come after you?" "Clem is too lazy to follow me across a territory line," me said. "He'll fume and he'll complain and he'll tell everyone in Redstone Crossing what a terrible woman I am, and then he'll hire someone else to do the cooking." She paused. "That's what he really cared about, the cooking." There was a silence, and then Hugh Thatcher laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. And the sound of it out in that big open morning was so good that me found herself laughing too, a small release of something that had been wound tight for months. They rode through the morning and stopped midday in the shade of a sandstone overhang where a seep of water came out of the rock, just enough for the horses. Hugh had brought food in his saddlebag, dried meat and cornbread, and a handful of dried apricots wrapped in cloth, and they sat in the shade of the rock and ate together in the manner of 2 people who have known each other longer than they have. Me told him about the letter from Clara Hennessy and the hat shop in Myra Wells and the room above it, and Hugh told her about the men he was delivering goods to in Myra Wells, a family named Galvez who had a large sheep operation south of town, and who had ordered the canvas for new lambing sheds. He told her about his ranch, which was called the Thatcher Place by everyone in the area, 1,200 acres of grazing land with a creek that ran even in dry years, 60 head of cattle currently and more in the spring, and 2 horses he was particularly proud of. "You do all of it yourself?" me asked. "I have 2 men who work for me," he said. "Brothers, Virgilio and Tomás Espinosa, good men. They've been with me 4 years. He said this with a quiet respect in his voice, the kind that indicated he did not consider them merely hired help but something more like partners or family. "Tomás's wife Esperanza does the cooking for the ranch house. I should tell you honestly that the cooking on the Thatcher Place is considerably better than I deserve." Me smiled. "What does the inside of your house look like?" He considered this. "Like a man lives there alone," he said. "Which means?" "Functional," he said. "Clean enough, Esperanza sees to that, but without much in the way of what you'd call refinement. There are 3 good chairs and a table, and the beds are solid, and the curtains are a color that I cannot tell you the name of because I bought the fabric without understanding that fabric had names." Me pressed her lips together to contain the smile. "What color do they appear to be to you?" "Brown," he said seriously. But the woman who sold them said something different. She may have said burnt umber. I'm not sure what umber is. It is a kind of brown, Mee told him. Well then I was right, he said. They got back on the road in the early afternoon, and the country changed as they moved south and west, the flat scrubland giving way to hills that folded and rolled in long curves. And by mid-afternoon they were in country that had the particular dramatic quality of the Southwest, the light doing things with shadows and color that Mee had never seen in Colorado, and that made her feel very small and very awake at the same time. They made camp that night by a dry wash where Hugh knew from experience that there was firewood and shelter from wind. He built a small fire and Mee unpacked the rest of the food and they cooked over the flames, a simple meal of beans from his pack and dried beef, and drank strong trail coffee and watched the stars come out over New Mexico, which was an event of such extraordinary magnitude that Mee simply sat with her coffee and looked up and did not speak for a long time. I have never seen so many stars, she said finally. You had them in Colorado, he said. Not like this, she said. Or maybe I never had time to look. He looked at her from across the fire, the light warming the planes of his face, and he said, What did you do before Harlan? I was a seamstress in my father's house from the time I was old enough to thread a needle, she said. My mother was a fine seamstress and she taught me everything. I also helped keep the accounts for my father's general store. I am good with numbers. She paused. My father sold me to Harlan, more or less. Not literally, but the understanding was that Harlan's money would help keep the store solvent, and in exchange, he got a wife who was young and had all her teeth. She said it without self-pity flatly because that was the truth of it and she had spent long enough being pitied, mostly by herself. Hugh was quiet for a moment. How old were you? 20, she said. Harlan was 38. The firelight shifted, and something crossed Hugh's face that was not anger exactly, but was in the same family. That was a wrong thing done to you, he said. Yes, she agreed. It was, and I have decided I am done having wrong things done to me, which is why I am sleeping by a campfire in New Mexico territory on my way to a hat shop. He looked at her across the flames, and the expression on his face was something she could not name, something warm and careful and entirely respectful. You are one of the clearest thinking people I have met, he said. I have had a lot of time to think, she said. Not much else to do on a long road. She slept wrapped in her coat and a bedroll Hugh produced from his pack, and she slept well, better than she had in months. Possibly because she was exhausted, but also because the fire burned low and steady, and she was not alone in the open dark the way she had feared she would be. They were back on the road before dawn again, and by midday the second day the country flattened out into a wide basin, and Hugh pointed ahead at a smear of green along a low line of hills and said, Myra Wells. Mee looked at it. Her heart did a complicated thing. She had been building this place in her imagination for 4 months, the town she was going to begin in, and now it was real and visible in front of her, and it was smaller than she had imagined, as most real things are smaller than their imagined versions, but it was solid and actual, and there were people living there who did not know her name yet. Nervous? Hugh asked. Yes, she said. Terrified, actually. Good, he said. Terror and courage look identical from the outside. She looked at him. Did someone tell you that, or did you figure it out yourself? I figured it out, he said. I was terrified for about 6 years straight when I first got here, and eventually I realized I was also brave, and the two things were happening simultaneously. Myra Wells was a town of perhaps 300 souls in the fall of 1878, growing slowly but steadily as the territory filled in, and the cattle trade brought commerce, and the commerce brought people. It had a main street of genuine substance, 2 hotels, a saloon that was lively but not lawless, a post office and telegraph office in the same building, a doctor's practice, a school under construction, and a string of shops that included, at the north end of the street and identifiable by its painted sign, H-E-N-N-E-S-S-E-Y-S Millinery and Fine Notions. Clara Hennessy was 43 years old, Irish-born, with red hair that was more gray than red now and a laugh that carried half a block. She came out the door of her shop before me had even fully dismounted because she had been watching the street, and she took both of me's hands in hers and looked at her steadily and said, "You're exactly as I pictured. Come in, we'll have tea and I'll show you everything." Hugh Thatcher tied the mule to the post outside and tipped his hat to Clara, who beamed at him. "Hugh, good to see you. You delivering to the Galvez family." "Soon as I leave the mare in the livery," he said. He looked at me. "You're all right now?" It was not a question, but it also sort of was, and me looked at him for a moment in the bright afternoon sun outside the millinery shop and felt something she was not prepared to name, something that sat in her chest warm and careful. "I'm all right," she said. He nodded. He took his roan and the mule and led them down the street toward the livery, and me watched him go for perhaps 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary before following Clara Hennessy inside. The shop was wonderful. It was the first time me had used that word to describe an interior space in years, possibly ever. It smelled of fabric and sizing, and the dried flowers Clara used to trim some of her hats, and every surface was in use. Bolts of fabric rolled out on the long table, hat forms on shelves, ribbon in every color cascading from a rack on the wall, and at the back was a doorway that led to a workroom with a proper seamstress table and good light from a north-facing window, and above the workroom, reached by a narrow staircase, was a room. Not a grand room. A modest room with a good bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the back garden, where Clara grew vegetables and a determined rosebush that was still producing in the September warmth. But it was me's room, no one else's. She would pay rent for it from her earnings at the shop, which Clara had outlined clearly in their letters, and she would have her own key to the outside door. She stood in the middle of that room for a long time after Clara showed her up, and she pressed her palm flat against the wall as if to test that it was real, and then she sat on the bed, and she cried, quietly and briefly, not from sadness, but from the particular relief of having arrived somewhere that was actually there. She heard Hugh Thatcher's voice in the street below, talking to someone in the easy way he had, and she went to the window and looked down. He was talking to an older Mexican man at the entrance to the alley, gesturing with his hands in the way he did when he was explaining something, nodding, listening to the man's response. The afternoon light was full on him, and he was laughing at something the other man said, and the laugh was the same one she had heard out on the morning road, genuine and unguarded, and me stood at her window watching Hugh Thatcher laugh on a street in Mae Wells, New Mexico territory, and knew she was in considerable trouble. The first week in Mae Wells was full. Clara set me to work immediately with a pile of orders that had been accumulating, alterations and new work both, and me found that her hands remembered everything her mother had taught them, the needle moving through fabric with a sureness that was its own kind of satisfaction. She was good at this. She had always been good at it, and nobody had ever said so. Clara said so on the third day, watching me's work with a critical eye that then became approving. "You're better than good," Clara said. "You're extraordinary. Where did you learn to do that seam?" "My mother," me said. "Then she was an artist," Clara said, which was the highest compliment Clara Hennessy had. Mae Wells revealed itself to me in the way that towns do when you actually live in them rather than passing through, in small discoveries and routine, and the faces that become familiar. The doctor was a young man named Prescott who had come from Philadelphia and was still slightly bewildered by the desert. The postmistress was a woman named Ada Trujillo, who was related to approximately a third of the town by blood or marriage, and who was therefore the single best source of information about anything that happened within 20 miles. The saloon was run by a man named Orville Kane, who was, improbably, a deeply principled person who cut off drunks before they became a problem, and once personally escorted a man to the edge of town for mistreating a horse. And Hugh Thatcher came back. Me had not entirely expected that, although she had found herself thinking about it more than she wanted to admit. He came back 12 days after he had delivered her to Clara Hennessy's door, riding into town on the roan with no particular business that anyone could immediately identify. And he went to the livery, and then he walked up the main street and came to the door of the millinery shop, as if he had always been planning to. Clara let him in with a smile that she directed very deliberately at the stitching in her hand, which meant she was hiding the smile, and Hugh stood in the middle of the shop and looked at me and said, "I was passing through." "You were not passing through," Me said without looking up from the hat she was trimming. "Your ranch is 12 miles from Calla Springs. Myra Wells is not on the road between your ranch and anything you need." There was a silence. "That is correct," he said. Me set down the hat. She looked at him. He was standing in the middle of all Clara's ribbons and hat forms and bolts of fabric, looking like exactly what he was, a man who spent his life outdoors in large open spaces, and yet he did not look uncomfortable there. He looked like a man who was willing to be wherever he needed to be to say a thing he had come to say. "I brought something," he said. He produced from his coat pocket a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and held it out to her. She came and took it and unwrapped it carefully. Inside were 6 spools of thread in colors she had not been able to find at the Calla Springs General Store, which she had mentioned in passing on the road, colors that Clara had been waiting for in her order from Santa Fe for 2 months. Good thread, the right colors. Me looked at the thread. She looked at him. "How did you know which colors?" she asked. "I wrote down what you said," he told her. She set the thread carefully on the workroom table behind her. "That was very kind," she said. "I was wondering," he said, and then stopped. He appeared to be a man who was much more comfortable with action than with this particular type of speech, and me found that she did not want to make it easy for him and also did want to make it easy for him simultaneously, which was a new and somewhat confusing experience. "I was wondering if you might like to have supper with me at the hotel. The food there is decent." "Clara," me said without looking away from Hugh. "Oh, I have plans this evening," Clara said from the front room, which was a blatant lie delivered with complete conviction. "Go." They had supper at the Myra Wells Hotel, which served the sort of food that was impressive for a town this size: roasted beef and potatoes and fresh bread, and a pie that was made from the last of the summer peaches. They sat at a corner table by the window, and the conversation went the way it had on the road, easy and genuine and full of the things they had not yet said to each other, and me found herself talking more than she had talked in years. She talked about her mother, who had died when me was 16, and who had taught her to sew and to keep accounts and to read properly, all the things that had turned out to matter. She talked about what she wanted, which was such a new and strange exercise that she kept stopping and starting, as if the wanting itself was a muscle she had not used in a long time. She wanted to be good at something and have that acknowledged. She wanted her own money. She wanted to live somewhere that felt like it belonged to her. Hugh listened to all of it. He did not interrupt to offer advice or to make it about himself. And when she paused, he asked questions that were the kind that showed he had been paying attention to the whole of what she said, not just waiting for his turn to speak. In return, he told her about Tennessee, the farm he had grown up on, his mother who had died young, his father who had worked himself to exhaustion on land that never quite gave back enough to justify it. He told her why leaving had been easy even though he had been 19 and afraid. He told her about the years before the ranch, working cattle drives, spending winters in line camps alone with 2 horses and a Bible and whatever other books he could find, reading everything he could get his hands on. He told her about buying his first piece of land with 3 years of savings and the feeling of standing on it and knowing it was his. "I understand that feeling," me said. "The room above the shop," he said. "The room above the shop," she confirmed. He walked her back along the main street to Clara's shop in the warm September night, and at the door he did not try to take her hand or push past any boundary, and me thought briefly that she might like it if he did push past a boundary, and then recognized that the reason she felt that way was precisely because he had not. When he simply said good night and stepped back, she said, without entirely planning to, "You should come to supper Sunday." Clara makes enough for 7, and there are usually only 3 of us." He looked at her with that careful warmth that she was beginning to recognize as the face he wore specifically for her, not the face he wore for the general world. "I'll be here Sunday," he said. He came Sunday. He came the Sunday after that. He fixed a hinge on the back door of the shop that had been sticking, because he noticed it sticking when he arrived, and he asked Clara if she had a screwdriver. And me watched him from the workroom doorway as he crouched in the backyard with the toolbox and worked with the neat, economical movements of a man who had spent years being his own carpenter and blacksmith and repairman. He stayed all afternoon and into the evening, and when he left me stood at the front window watching the street after he had gone, which was becoming a habit. "Well," Clara said from behind her, not unkindly. "Don't," me said. "I haven't said anything," Clara said. "You're thinking it extremely loudly," me said. Clara laughed and went back to her sewing. October came in cool and brilliant, the desert sky going that particular deep blue of autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek at the edge of town turning gold. Me had settled into the life of the shop with a thoroughness that pleased her. She had taken on 3 regular customers of her own, women who came specifically for her alteration work, and who had begun spreading the word about the quality of her stitching. She had money in her pocket that she had earned, which was a feeling she turned over and examined every time it happened, like a smooth stone, satisfying in the hand. Hugh came through Myra Wells twice more in October, and each time stayed longer, and each time the thing between them settled deeper into something that me could no longer pretend was just friendliness. She was not afraid of it. She was cautious with it, the way you are cautious with something that seems very good and that you have been taught by experience to distrust. She examined it from several angles. She looked for what it was trying to take from her. She looked for the trap. She could not find one. She was sitting on the step at the back of the shop on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, in the last of the day's sunlight, hemming a dress for the wife of the land surveyor who had recently arrived in Myra Wells, when she heard the gate and looked up, and Hugh Thatcher was coming through the back garden gate with his hat in his hand. "I wasn't expecting you until Sunday," she said. "I know," he said. He came and sat on the step beside her, leaving a proper distance, his hat in his lap, looking out at Clara's garden. The rosebush had finally given up its last flowers and was just dark canes now against the adobe wall. "I have something I want to say to you, and I kept waiting for Sunday, but Sunday is 4 days away, and I've been riding around talking to cattle about it, and Virgilio finally told me to stop being a coward and come say it." Me set down her hemming. "Virgilio sounds like a wise man," she said. "He is," Hugh said. "Wiser than me about most things." He turned and looked at her then directly, the way he always did, without evasion or performance. "Me, I know you've had a hard time of it. I know you came out here to start something for yourself, and I think what you're building is worth everything you put into it. I'm not trying to take any of that from you. I want to say that first." Me folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. "I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you," he said. "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I won't start now. I think about you every day. I think about you when I'm out working the cattle and when I'm riding fence and when I'm trying to sleep. You are the most interesting person I have met in 12 years out here, and I would very much like to court you properly if you let me." He paused. "I understand if that's not what you want. You don't owe me anything, and I won't make things difficult between us if you say no, but I needed to say it." The garden was very quiet in the late afternoon. Somewhere down the street someone was hammering. The rosebush scratched softly against the adobe wall in the small wind. Me had thought she would need a great deal of time if this moment came. She had thought she would need to be careful and measured and slow. And she was careful and measured and slow. She was all of those things. But she had also been watching Hugh Thatcher for 2 months and listening to him and thinking about him, and she knew, with a clarity that felt clean and unafraid, what she thought. "I would like that very much," she said. The expression on his face was something she wanted to keep. the careful weight of it relaxing, not into relief exactly, but into something fuller and quieter and real. "Sunday still," he said. "Sunday still," she said. "But you can stay for supper tonight if you came all this way." "I came 60 miles," he said. "Then you're definitely staying for supper," she said. The courtship was conducted in the manner of two adults who already knew each other reasonably well, which meant it skipped the tentative opening stages and went straight into the deeper kind of getting to know, the kind that requires honesty. Hugh came to Myra Wells regularly, sometimes weekly, and me rode out to the Thatcher Ranch for the first time in early November on a clear, cold morning, accompanied by Clara because Clara insisted on it, and because me actually wanted company for the first visit. The Thatcher Ranch was everything he had described and more. The house was low and solid, built of adobe and timber, with a long front porch that faced the mountains and a creek behind that ran clear over smooth stones. The curtains were indeed an undistinguished brownish color. The kitchen was large and well-equipped because Esperanza Espinosa had clear opinions about kitchen equipment. And Esperanza herself was a small, fierce woman of about 35 who looked me over with dark, intelligent eyes, and then produced coffee and the most extraordinary sweet bread me had ever tasted, which me told her honestly, and which seemed to satisfy Esperanza enough to lower her vigilance by about half. Virgilio and Tomás Espinosa were working horses in the corral when me and Clara arrived, and Virgilio, who was the elder of the two, and had the cheerful, weathered face of a man who found the world consistently amusing, raised his hand in greeting and called something in Spanish to Hugh that made Tomás laugh and Hugh go slightly red at the back of his neck, which me filed away with considerable interest. She walked the creek with Hugh in the afternoon, just the two of them, while Clara sat on the porch with Esperanza and accomplished the kind of rapid and comprehensive information exchange that women manage in the first 20 minutes of acquaintance. Hugh showed her the cattle grazing in the lower pasture, the south field he was planning to fence come spring, the place where the creek went underground in summer and came back up 100 yards later, which he found genuinely fascinating and which me found fascinating because he found it so. He had taken her hand at the creek, quietly, without ceremony, and she had let him keep it. They walked back to the house hand in hand in the long copper afternoon light, and me thought she had never in her life been this simply comfortable with another person. November brought colder weather, and the rhythm of their courtship settled into something that the whole town of Myra Wells appeared to take a proprietary interest in. Ada Trujillo at the post office said approvingly that Hugh Thatcher was a good man, and that it was past time he had someone to think about besides cattle. Dr. Prescott mentioned that the ranch would benefit from what he called a civilizing influence, and then apologized because he realized that sounded wrong. Clara said nothing at all and smiled constantly. On a Saturday evening in mid-November, after supper at the hotel and a long walk down the main street in the cold, starry night, Hugh stopped them at the far end of the boardwalk where the town petered out into the open desert and turned to face her, and she could see in the silver dark that he was working himself up to something important. "Me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. "And I want to ask it properly, which means I have to tell you some things first." "All right," she said. "The ranch is mine clear," he said. "No debt on it. I have 60 head now and I'm adding more. There's good grass and water, and it's the kind of land that's worth more every year as this territory settles. I'm not rich, not by the standards of places like Santa Fe or Denver, but I'm solid and I intend to stay that way." He paused. "I know you didn't come out here to marry another man. I know you came out here to have something of your own, and I am not asking you to give that up. I would never ask you to give that up. Whatever you have at Clara's shop, that's yours, and I want it to stay yours. He stopped. He looked at her. "I want to share my life with you. That's the whole of it. I want to build what comes next with you in it." Me stood in the cold November night in Myra Wells, New Mexico territory, and looked at Hugh Thatcher, who was 31 years old and owned 1,200 acres of good grazing land and had hazel green eyes and walked too quietly and had written down the colors of thread she needed. And she thought about freedom and what it actually was. She had thought freedom was the opposite of belonging to someone. She had thought freedom meant being entirely and only her own. But she had been free from Mae Reed for 8 months now, and she had been building her own life, and it was good. It was genuinely good, and what she felt when she was with Hugh was not the diminishment she had known before. It was something that added rather than subtracted, something that doubled rather than halved. If we were married, she said carefully, and I continued working at Clara's shop and the money I earned was mine, it would be yours, he said immediately. I would never touch it or tell you what to do with it. That is your work and your earning and none of my business. And if I had opinions about the ranch, she said, about decisions, I would want your opinions, he said. I told you you're the clearest thinking person I know. Why would I want to run a ranch without the clearest thinking person I know telling me when I'm being a fool? Mae looked at him for a long, full moment. You understand that I will tell you when you're being a fool, she said, without softening it. I expect nothing less, he said. Then yes, she said. Hugh Thatcher, yes. He pulled her in then, both arms, and held her against him in the cold dark, and she felt his heart beating under her cheek, and she put her arms around him and held on, and the night was very still and very full of stars, and somewhere behind them, the lights of Myra Wells glowed warm and constant. They were married on a Saturday in December of 1878, the 15th, which was cold but clear, the sort of winter day in New Mexico when the sky is so blue it looks painted. Clara made me a dress in deep green wool that showed off the color of her dark hair and made the most of her figure, and Esperanza Espinosa baked 3 kinds of sweet bread and a cake and took full credit for the match, which nobody disputed because arguing with Esperanza was its own kind of adventure. The ceremony was small and honest, performed by a circuit judge named Hewitt who came through Myra Wells monthly and who seemed genuinely pleased to be doing something celebratory for once. Ada Trujillo was there, and Dr. Prescott and Orville Kane from the saloon, who brought a bottle of something he said was exceptional and would not be opened until after the ceremony. Virgilio and Tomás Espinosa stood in their best clothes on Hugh's side, and Virgilio wept without apparent embarrassment, which made Tomás stare at the ceiling. Mr. Galvez and his wife came from their sheep operation south of town, and a handful of townspeople who had become Mae's regular customers filled out the rest of the small crowd. When Judge Hewitt asked Hugh if he took Mae Reed to be his wife, Hugh said, "I do," in a voice that was entirely steady and filled with everything he had already said on the boardwalk and more. And when Mae said the same thing back, she said it with the full weight of having chosen it freely, which was the thing that mattered most, the only thing that mattered, the choosing. Hugh kissed her in front of everyone with a quiet thoroughness that made Clara press her handkerchief to her face and Ada Trujillo elbow her husband. And when they separated, Mae was laughing, and Hugh was smiling the way she loved best, surprised and unguarded and entirely himself. They spent their first night in the hotel, since the ranch was a full day's ride, and on Sunday morning they rode out together in the winter sunlight, Mae's things loaded on a rented pack horse, toward the Thatcher ranch that was now her home. She had made an agreement with Clara before the wedding, carefully worked out, that she would continue to do piecework for the shop, the fine work that required her specific skill, working from home on her own hours, and that when she came into Myra Wells for supply days or simply for visiting, she would work at the shop as needed. It was an arrangement that satisfied both of them entirely, Clara because Mae's work was irreplaceable, and Mae because the work was hers. The ranch was different in winter, quieter, the cattle down in the lower pastures near the water, the mornings biting cold before the sun came up, and then warm and golden in the afternoons. Mae moved through the house and made it different by being in it, not by changing it dramatically but by adding herself to it, the way a fire changes a room, not structurally but in quality and warmth. She ordered new curtains in a fabric she described to Hugh as Prussian blue, which he held up to the light and said looked like exactly what the other curtains should have been. And she unpacked her sewing things into the second bedroom, which became her workroom, and she put her grandmother's brooch in a small glass dish on the bedroom dresser, where the morning light caught it and made it beautiful. Esperanza showed her the kitchen with the air of someone demonstrating a cathedral, which was fair, because the kitchen was exceptional, and me learned Esperanza's routines and worked alongside her without trying to take over, which was the correct approach, and which Esperanza appreciated with the restrained warmth of a woman who respects people who know their limits. Hugh showed her the ranch in the proper way, the winter way, the daily round of feeding and checking cattle, and looking at the south fence and watching the creek level. He showed her the horses, the two he was particularly proud of, a bay stallion named Adobe and a gray mare named Silver that was too young to be ridden hard yet and that had the look of something extraordinary in her movement. "She'll be yours," Hugh said, standing at the corral fence with the gray mare nuzzling his shoulder. "When she's ready." Me looked at the mare. "She's beautiful," she said. "You're good with horses," Hugh said. "I noticed that the first day, the way you were with that mare on the road. You were watching very carefully for a stranger," she said. "You interested me," he said simply. Winter settled into the ranch like a long, slow breath, and the days had a rhythm and a rightness to them that me found she was not suspicious of any more, which itself felt new and worth noting. She wrote letters to Clara and received letters back. She sent work back to the shop, fine things, embroidered work and carefully fitted garments that Clara said were the best things on her shelves. She learned the Thatcher ranch from the inside out, every drainage and every pasture and every particular character of every animal, and she found that she had opinions about the cattle operation, specific and reasoned opinions, and Hugh listened to them and argued back when he disagreed and changed his mind when she made a good case, which she found to be one of the most satisfying experiences of her adult life. She learned things about Hugh in the winter quiet that she would not have known in the rush of spring or summer, the way he read in the evenings, seriously, marking passages that interested him with small pieces of paper, and the books were not only practical but literary. He had Dickens and George Eliot and Shakespeare in a rough shelf above the fireplace, and he had read all of them more than once. The way he was with the Espinosa brothers, not employer and employees, but something more like family, equal and trusting. The way he got up in the night when the temperature dropped hard and went out to check the cattle without waking anyone, not because anyone would judge him for not going, but because it was what he thought was right. He was, she thought on many evenings, watching him across the dinner table or across a room, a thoroughly good man. Not a simple man or an easy man. He had strong opinions and a stubbornness on certain points that took getting used to, but good in the fundamental way that mattered, good in the deep grain of him. She told him this one evening in January, coming at it sideways the way she did with important things. They were by the fire after supper, both reading, and she looked up from her book and said, "You're a good man, Hugh Thatcher." He looked up from his own book. "What brought that on?" "I've been thinking it for a while," she said. "I wanted to say it out loud." He looked at her with that particular expression, the warm, careful one. "You're the best thing that has come into my life," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know it," she said. She looked back at her book and then looked up again. "I feel the same." Spring came to the Thatcher ranch the way it always does in New Mexico, fast and full. The desert suddenly alive with color after the winter, the creosote and sage throwing their sharp green smell into the warming air, and the cattle moving up to the summer pastures with a restlessness that had to be managed carefully. Hugh and Virgilio and Tomás were busy from before dawn to after dark for the whole of April and into May with the calving and the branding and the fence work. And me moved through those weeks running the household and her own sewing business and managing the ranch accounts, which Hugh had asked her to take on because he said with complete sincerity that she was better at them than he was. In May, with the ranch settled into its spring rhythm, and the accounts for the quarter balanced and sitting in a neat ledger on the desk. Mae told Hugh that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, while Esperanza was conspicuously doing something extremely focused in the garden, which meant Esperanza already suspected and had arranged to be elsewhere for the telling. Hugh was sitting at the kitchen table with his second coffee of the morning, and his hat not yet on, and his face open in the way it was first thing in the morning, and Mae came and stood beside him and put her hand on his shoulder and said, "I believe we are going to need another chair at this table come winter." He looked up at her. Then he was standing, both hands on her face, looking at her with an expression so full of feeling that she could see the effort it took to hold it all at once. "Me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I believe so. Clara suspects it too. She keeps looking at me with that expression." He kissed her then, thoroughly and carefully, and then held her against him the way he had on the boardwalk in November, with that quality of a man holding something he still cannot quite believe is his. "Are you all right?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," she said. "Good, actually. A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise fine." She put her hands against his chest and felt his heart. "Hugh, are you happy?" "I don't have a word big enough for what I am," he said. Esperanza came back into the kitchen approximately 4 minutes later than was believable, took one look at both of them, and immediately produced from somewhere a special sweet bread that she apparently kept in reserve for significant occasions. The pregnancy moved through the summer in good health and uncomplicated rhythm, Mae continuing her work and her life with the practical determination that characterized everything she did, though she accepted help more readily than she might have before, which she thought was its own kind of growth. Dr. Prescott came out from Myra Wells in July at her request and pronounced her excellently healthy and the baby well-positioned, and gave her a list of sensible recommendations that she already mostly knew. Clara came to stay for 2 weeks in August, ostensibly to bring a large order of sewing work, but actually to fuss over me in a way that Mae found she did not mind at all. Clara and Esperanza established an immediate and highly functional dynamic in which they both had clear opinions about how to take care of me, and managed to agree on most of them. And the household in August felt particularly full and warm and good. Hugh was attentive in the way that a man is when something is both precious and beyond his ability to control, which was to say he was sometimes hovering, and needed to be told gently to go tend to the cattle, which he accepted with good grace. Mae rode Silver, who was old enough now and strong and responsive, and exactly everything she had hoped, through most of the summer, only stopping when the doctor advised it in the 8th month. She missed riding. She told Silver this directly, standing at the corral fence, and Silver put her gray nose against Mae's shoulder with a sympathy that was unmistakably equine. The baby was born on a Wednesday in early November, 1879, delivered by Dr. Prescott in the bedroom of the Thatcher ranch house with Clara and Esperanza, both present and Hugh in the kitchen being extremely quiet, which Virgilio later said was the loudest silence he had ever heard. The baby was a boy, 8 pounds and healthy, with Hugh's dark hair and Mae's particular expression of alert assessment that Clara identified immediately. When Prescott brought Hugh into the bedroom, Mae was sitting up against the pillows holding the baby in the blanket Esperanza had made, and Hugh came and sat on the bed's edge and looked at his son for a long, full, wordless moment. Then he looked at Mae. "You're all right," he said, and it was both a question and a statement, and it was everything. "I'm wonderful," Mae said. "Hold your son." He took the baby with the careful hands of a man used to handling things that require gentleness, and the expression on his face as he looked down at the boy was something Mae thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the particular quality of wonder and love and responsibility arriving all at once. "What shall we call him?" Hugh said. "I thought James," Mae said. "After your father's middle name, you told me that once on the road." Hugh looked at her. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you said on the road," she told him. James William Thatcher was named at the end of the first week when it became clear that the name suited him, which Clara said you could always tell if you were patient about it, and let the baby demonstrate the name's fit for a few days. James was a serious baby in the beginning, looking at the world with those assessing dark eyes, and then at 6 weeks he smiled at Virgilio, and Virgilio made a sound that no one had ever heard him make before and went outside to recover himself. Christmas of 1879 at the Thatcher Ranch was a gathering. Clara came from Myra Wells and brought Ada Trujillo and her husband Eduardo, who played the guitar magnificently. The Galvez family came from their sheep operation, all 7 of them, which made the house feel full in the best way. Esperanza and Tomás and Virgilio sat at the same table as everyone else because that was how the Thatcher household worked, and it was not up for discussion. There was food on every surface, and the fire was going, and the baby was passed from person to person, and received each new set of arms with the equanimity of a child who had already decided the world was basically all right. Hugh stood in the doorway of his kitchen on Christmas evening watching all of this, and Mae came and stood beside him and leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and they watched Clara teaching Ada Trujillo's youngest daughter a cat's cradle with a piece of string, while Virgilio and Eduardo played the guitar together in the corner, and James slept in his cradle untroubled by the music. "This is the life," Hugh said quietly. "Yes," Mae agreed. "This is exactly it." The years that followed had the quality of good years that know what they are, years that fill up solidly and without waste. The ranch grew. By 1881, Hugh had added 300 acres to the south, good grazing land that he had been watching for 2 years waiting for the right moment, and the cattle herd was at 130 head. Mae's arrangement with Clara had expanded into something that was half partnership, Clara having officially named Mae a partner in Hennessy and Reed Fine Notions in the spring of 1880, the Reed being Mae's insistence on keeping her own name in the business, and it was by that point well known enough in the territory that orders came in from as far as Santa Fe. The Espinosa family grew too. Tomás and Esperanza had a daughter, Rosalinda, born in the summer of 1880, and then another, Carmen, in 1882, and the ranch became a place where children ran between the legs of adults who watched out for all of them. James Thatcher grew from a serious baby into a serious little boy with his mother's clear eyes and his father's easy confidence in the outdoors, and he could name every cow in the herd by the time he was 3, which Virgilio claimed was a record. In 1880, Mae had a conversation with Hugh about Clem Reed that had been waiting for a long time. A letter had arrived, forwarded through Clara, and then through the Myra Wells post office, from Redstone Crossing, Colorado. Mae had held it for 2 days before opening it. It was from Clem, and it was not threatening. It was, surprisingly, perfunctory. He had sold the homestead. He was moving to his wife's family in Kansas. He was writing because the lawyer handling the sale had found in the estate papers a document indicating that the bay horse called Juniper had been given to Mae by Harlan in a note not formally witnessed, and therefore not legally binding, but Clem was willing to sign off on it if she wanted the animal. He had also included, without comment, a small box containing Mae's mother's thimble, which Mae had thought was lost. Mae sat with the letter and the thimble for a long while at the kitchen table, and Hugh sat across from her and did not speak, which was the right thing. "I think he feels guilty," Mae said finally. "He ought to," Hugh said, "but not with venom, just as a fact." "I don't want the horse," Mae said. "I have silver." She looked at the thimble, which was silver with a small engraved flower on the band, her mother's thimble, used for 30 years. "He sent this. He didn't have to." "No," Hugh said. "People are complicated," Mae said. "They are," Hugh agreed. She wrote back briefly, thanked him for the thimble, declined the horse, wished him well in Kansas, and closed the door on Redstone Crossing with the particular finality of a woman who has put down a heavy thing she has been carrying long enough. James was given a little brother in March of 1882, a cheerful and vocal arrival named Robert Thomas Thatcher, who announced himself loudly, and continued to do so for the first 3 years of his life, which was a contrast to James's gravity that the family found endlessly entertaining. Hugh said that Robert was his own personality and would not be influenced by environment, which James demonstrated was correct by continuing to be grave and thoughtful regardless of his brother's theatrics. The school in Myra Wells was completed and operating by 1881, and me was on the committee that worked to keep it funded and to hire and retain teachers, which turned out to be primarily a matter of writing letters and organizing donations, and occasionally providing strong tea and persuasion to people who needed both. She was good at this. She discovered she was good at many things she had never been given room to find out about before. In the spring of 1883, something happened that me would think about for a long time afterward. She rode Silver into Myra Wells for a supply day and stopped at the new telegraph office, which had been established when the line came through in 1882, and the young man there handed her a telegram. It was from a woman named Judith Stair in Denver, who was a journalist for a women's paper there, and who had somehow heard about Hennessy and Reed Fine Notions, and specifically about the seamstress work me did, and wanted to write a small feature about women who had built enterprises in the new territories. Me read the telegram twice standing in the telegraph office. She went to Clara's shop and showed Clara, who read it and then looked up with her red-gray hair and her sharp eyes and said, "Well, well," me agreed. She wired back that she would be willing to correspond about it, and what followed was a series of letters over the spring in which she told Judith Stair the parts of the story she was willing to tell. Not all of it, not Harlan, not the leaving in the dark, but the arrival in New Mexico, the work at the shop, the partnership with Clara, the way the territory was filling with women who were making things rather than waiting. The article appeared in the Denver Women's Paper in August, and Clara bought 20 copies when they came through the post and gave them out to everyone she knew, and me read her own name in print, Mae Thatcher, formerly Mae Reed, and felt something settle and complete in a way that was quiet and absolute. Hugh read the article and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Formerly Mae Reed." "You noticed that," she said. "I noticed," he said, "but you kept Reed in the business name." "Reed was mine before it was Harlan's," she said. "My mother's family name before she married my father. It was Reed before any of that. I kept it for her." He looked at her. "Of course you did," he said. In the autumn of 1883, James Thatcher started school in Myra Wells, which required boarding with Clara during the week, a solution Clara embraced with the enthusiasm of a woman who had always wanted children around without having managed it herself. And James adapted to this arrangement with the practicality that was his particular nature, studying seriously and writing neat letters home to his parents on Fridays that were already more grammatically precise than many adults achieved. Robert was 4 and fierce with the unfairness of having been left behind, and spent a significant portion of the autumn following Virgilio around the ranch demanding information about everything. Me and Hugh rode together on Sunday mornings when the weather allowed, an old habit from the earliest days, and the land was as beautiful to them as it had ever been, the high desert in every season, the particular light of each time of year. They were not the same two people who had met on a dusty road at the Colorado-New Mexico border, which was as it should be, and they were also exactly those people in the ways that mattered, and this was something me thought about on those Sunday rides, the way people carry their whole history forward inside them, all the worn smooth stones of it. "What are you thinking?" Hugh asked her on one of those mornings in October, the desert sage silver with early frost. "About the road," she said, "the day we met." "You nearly ran me over," he said. "Your horse was in the middle of the road," she said. "It was my road," he said with entirely false dignity. "No road in open country belongs to anyone," she told him. "You said away," he said after a moment, "when I asked where you were going." "I did," she said. "And I asked from what," he said. "You never did get the full answer," she said. He looked at her across the space between their horses, the open morning country around them, the mountains pale blue in the distance, the cattle visible as dark shapes in the lower pasture. "I think I got it," he said. "Over time." "You did," she agreed. "You were patient about it." "You were worth being patient about," he said. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, the way he had taken hers at the creek on the second day, quietly and without ceremony. And he held it the same way he always had, firmly, warmly, without pressure. They rode back to the ranch in the October morning, and the smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney, and Robert could be heard from 300 yards away arguing with one of the younger calves about something. And Esperanza's voice came through the window with a brisk Spanish correction that applied to both the child and the animal equally. James's last letter was on the desk, read and answered, stamped and ready to send to Myra Wells. Silver was in the corral, gray and beautiful, tossing her head. Adobe put his nose over the corral fence as Hugh rode in and blew a companionable breath against Hugh's sleeve. Me dismounted and stood in the yard of the Thatcher ranch in the autumn morning and looked at all of it, the house and the outbuildings and the creek just audible behind the cottonwoods and the mountains permanent and magnificent beyond, and thought about a woman on a borrowed horse crossing a territory line in a cloud of red dust, running towards something she could not yet name. She had named it now. She had named all of it. She went inside where the coffee was hot, and Esperanza was doing something magnificent with the cornmeal, and Robert came running through the door a half-minute later full of a story about the calf that needed telling immediately. And Hugh came in behind him and shut the door on the cold morning and looked across the kitchen at me with those hazel-green eyes and the full warmth of everything they had built between them. And me smiled at her husband, the real smile. The one she had only lately learned to let out without examining it first. And the kitchen filled with the sound of their son's voice, and the smell of Esperanza's cooking, and the particular close warmth of a house full of people who had chosen each other. By 1885, the territory was changing faster than any of them had quite tracked from day to day. The railroad had reached close enough that things moved differently, supplies and news and people all arriving with a new speed that took getting used to. Myra Wells had grown to something more like a proper town, with a new church and a proper school building and a lawyer's office and a second doctor who had come because Prescott alone could no longer manage. Hennessy and Reed had moved into a larger space on the main street, and me made the trip in several times a week now because the business warranted it. Hugh had taken on 2 more men for the ranch and was considering whether to expand the horse operation, the selling of good broke horses being something he was increasingly interested in and at which he was increasingly skilled. Me had opinions about this, which she expressed at length over several evenings, and her primary opinion was that it was a good idea and he should do it properly and not by halves, and her secondary opinion was that Silver's foals should be the foundation of it, which Hugh said was exactly what he had been thinking. They had these conversations the way they had all their conversations, directly and without performance, 2 people working on the same problem from different angles and finding they reached the same place. Robert started school in the autumn of 1884 and immediately charmed his teacher, a young woman from Ohio who wrote to me after the first week to say that Robert was exceptionally bright and exceptionally social, and she was very much enjoying having him, which me received with the particular mix of pride and amusement that Robert consistently inspired. James came home for summers and school breaks and was already taller than his mother at 9, with the quiet, serious manner that had always been his and an appetite for reading that matched his father's. And on summer evenings, the Thatcher household had 2 people reading at the fireside, which me thought was one of the most satisfying sights she had encountered. She had, in the years since arriving in New Mexico territory, accumulated something that she turned over sometimes in her mind, with the same satisfaction she had once felt turning over that first earned coin. She had her work, which was genuinely hers and recognized as fine. She had her partnership with Clara, who was her closest friend and who had given her the first real professional standing she had ever had. She had the ranch that was her home and her understanding of every foot of it. She had Esperanza, who she thought of as family without needing to formalize it, and the Espinosa girls growing up alongside her own sons like cousins. She had Ada Trujillo and her inexhaustible knowledge of everything and her husband Eduardo's guitar. She had the gray mare and the Sunday mornings on the open land. She had her grandmother's brooch on the bedroom dresser and her mother's thimble in the workroom beside the sewing table. And she had Hugh Thatcher, every day, who was 37 years old now and had silver coming in at his temples and who still walked too quietly and still looked at her with those hazel green eyes full of everything he meant and never bothered to disguise, and who had never once in 7 years of marriage made her feel smaller than she was. On their 7th anniversary in December of 1885, Hugh came into the workroom where Mae was finishing an order, a fine embroidered shirtwaist for a woman in Santa Fe who had ordered 3 of them through a contact of Clara's, and he stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the doorway of Clara's shop the first time he came back, with that quality of a man who has come to say something. "You look like you're working up to something," Mae said without looking up from her work. "I have a gift," he said. She put down her needle and looked at him. He was holding something behind his back in a way that Robert would have done, and which she found entirely charming. She held out her hand. He produced a small leather-bound book with her initials on the front, M.T. Mae Thatcher, and inside, in Hugh's handwriting that she knew as well as her own, were the accounts of the ranch for the past 7 years, all of them, the whole arc of what they had built, every year's cattle numbers and land records and expenses and income. And on the last page he had written a single paragraph that was not accounts at all. She read it in the lamplight of the workroom. It said, "You came across a territory line on a borrowed horse with $32 and a plan, and you have made everything you decided to make. This ranch is better for you. These children are better for you. I am better for you. I am grateful every day for the road that brought you to me, and for the fact that I happened to be on it. Your husband, Hugh." Mae sat with the book in her hands for a long time. The lamp was warm, and outside the winter night was clear and full of stars, the deep New Mexico dark, and the house was quiet because the boys were asleep and Esperanza had gone home for the evening, and the fire was burning low and steady in the front room. She looked up at her husband, who was watching her from the doorway with that warm, careful expression, and she said, "That road was the best road I ever took." "You were the best thing on it," he said. She went to him and he held her, and the house held them, and the night held the house, and the territory held the night, all of it vast and open and entirely theirs. The years kept being good years. James and Robert grew into young men who knew who they were, partly because they had been shown what that looked like, and the Thatcher Ranch expanded into horse breeding as Mae had advocated, and Silver's bloodline produced animals that were known across 3 territories for their quality and their soundness. Clara retired from daily work at the shop in 1887, but remained a partner in name and spirit, and came to the ranch for long visits, and continued to produce opinions about hats and life with equal confidence. The school Mae had helped fund turned out graduates who went on to places that Myra Wells had never quite sent anyone before, which she thought about with a quiet satisfaction that had to do with something larger than her own story. Myra Wells continued its patient growth, and the territory continued its transformation, and Mae Thatcher, formerly Mae Reed, who had crossed a line in the red dust of 1878 with $32 and a borrowed horse and a plan, watched all of it from inside a life she had chosen and built and filled, and found that it was more than enough, found that it was in fact the exact fullness she had been running toward all along without quite knowing it. The thing she could not have named when a man on a roan horse had asked her where she was going and she had said away. Away had turned out to be here. Right here in this kitchen on this land in this life, with these hands that still moved surely through fine fabric, with this man who had walked too quietly into her story and stayed, with these children who were their own clear people, with the mountains permanent on the horizon and the creek running behind the cottonwoods and the gray mare in the corral and the coffee always strong, and the stars of New Mexico still more extraordinary than anywhere she had been or would go. She had arrived. She was home.